I'm Heath Lambert. You're listening to Marked by Grace, a podcast applying the grace of Jesus to all of life. Covert narcissism. That is the topic we're dealing with on Marked by Grace this week. Maybe you wanted to talk about covert narcissism. If you did, you're about to be happy. Maybe you don't want to talk about covert narcissism. And if that is true for you, then I want to extend an invitation to you to send your questions and your comments, your concerns into Marked by Grace at fbcjax.com. That's Marked by Grace at fbcjax with an x.com. I try to get to as many of those questions as I can. This is a good reminder, a good opportunity for me to remind you about the way this works. In general terms, I record all of the Marked by Graces for a month in one session. And before I record those episodes, I get from our wonderful staff a list of all the questions that you have sent in. I don't necessarily, in fact, I hardly ever see the context of those questions. I just get the list of questions on an Excel spreadsheet. And from that, I go, okay, hey, it looks like these would be some ones to take for this month, either because there's a topic that's relevant to stuff that's going on that month, or because it seems like there's an inordinate amount of questions on it. But we take 4 and then we move on with it. That is to say that I realize for every person that sends in a question, there's a story behind that. And most of the time, it's impossible for me to know what that story is. Even if you told me in the email, I don't usually get to see that because of the list of questions that I receive from the staff. So one of the things that I know is by the time somebody's asking a question about covert narcissism, there's a story there. I just can't know what it is. So this question has been sent in a number of times. I want to try to answer it. And in the specifics of the question that I have are these. It's actually a question in 2 parts. Is covert narcissism rampant in the church? And should covert narcissists be fired? There's a story there. I don't know what the story is, but somebody's wanting to know if this problem of narcissism's all over the church and if those problems ought to be terminated. So let me just take the question at face value. And first, most people are going to need to know what narcissism is. It might be that the person asking the question needs to know what narcissism is. Narcissism is a secular term in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So it is a term that comes to us in what's called the DSM. That term, that problem, first appeared in the DSM in the 1980s. And from the 1980s until now, the understanding of the term, the descriptors of the term have changed a lot. There have been a lot of adjustments and a lot of amendments. But the key indicators for a narcissist in the DSM would be several things. A grandiose sense of self-importance, someone who believes they are special and unique, somebody who requires excessive admiration, somebody who is envious of others or believes other people are envious of them, somebody who is arrogant or haughty. That is language that the DSM uses to elaborate on this secular idea of narcissism. Now, you listen to that list of descriptors that I just went through, and it sounds an awful lot like a problem the Bible describes as pride. I think when we use the language of narcissism out there in the world, that is a secular term from secular people for the spiritual problem of pride. 1 John chapter 2, verse 16 says, "All that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world." When we talk about spiritual pride, we're talking about an arrogant person. We're talking about somebody who is self-exalting, sinfully so. We talk about somebody who is opposed to the Father and seeks to lift up themselves. I think this problem of pride is the root problem in the heart of every sinner. That is to say, that if you are listening to this podcast, if you are watching this podcast, then your root problem, the main problem you've got, is pride. It's not as though some people are prideful and other people aren't. It's not as though that person is prideful and you're not. The root problem that sinners have is that we all have a problem of pride. We all have a desire to exalt ourselves above others and to exalt ourselves above the Lord. And it is that sinful pride, that sinful self-exaltation, that actually is the root of every other one of our sinful attitudes and our sinful actions. And so, what is narcissism? Well, it's what secularists call pride. Is it rampant in the church? And the answer is yes, of course it is. If we're talking about pride, we're talking about a problem that we all have. The problem is not the problem that is secularly described by the language of narcissism. The problem that we all have is the one that is biblically and spiritually described by the language of pride. And so, unfortunately, sadly, to our own destruction, yes, narcissism, a biblical understanding of pride, is what is rampant in the church. And so then here comes the other question: should covert narcissists be fired? You know, it's funny, we're talking about the language of narcissist and covert narcissists. Well, just again to transpose that language into biblical language of pride, sometimes our pride is manifest, and sometimes our pride is covert. It's pride nonetheless. When it's covert, we're deceiving ourselves, and we might be deceiving others. But the question is, should such a person who is guilty of undercover pride, a covert narcissist, should that person be fired if indeed they're employed by the church? Well, you got to answer that question on biblical grounds. So we don't just get to have our own opinions about who is qualified and who is not to work in the church. So one passage that's very relevant for this, because it talks about the qualifications for pastors, is 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 6. And here's what the Bible says: "He, the pastor, must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil." So here, one qualification for a pastor is that they not be puffed up with conceit. Now, it's important to say that the requirement here is not that the pastor not be prideful. Again, the fundamental problem of every person this side of heaven is that we struggle with some kind of pride. You've got it, I've got it. There's not going to be a pastor in the country, a religious leader, a staff person in the country that doesn't have some kind of pride exposed or hidden. That's just going to be the way it is. So the requirement is not, you can't be prideful. The language of the text in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 6 is you can't be swollen with conceit. That is what is forbidden. You're not allowed to be living out of a manifest problem of conceit and pride. There is all the difference in the world between a qualified pastor who struggles with the sin of pride, as we all do, but is really struggling by the grace of Jesus to put it off. And there is all the difference in the world between that man and a disqualified pastor who is swollen with conceit, exposed or covert. All the difference in the world between somebody who is swollen with that conceit and is just letting it rain in his life. Somebody who's doing that, again, whether it's covert or exposed, somebody who's doing that, who's swollen with conceit, who's living out of their pride, is a man who is disqualified. We would not say that he's disqualified because of a secular description of a problem of narcissism that's found in a secular manual like the DSM. we'd say he's disqualified for spiritual ones. For spiritual reasons. And we should only say that such a man is disqualified because he's swollen with conceit, not when we make an observation from 40,000 feet about his life and we make assumptions and we develop premature conclusions, but when people who are very close to that servant see that this isn't a person who's struggling with pride, who's trying to put off pride. This is a person who is swollen with conceit and living in their pride and out of their pride. And this is a person who is disqualified from Christian ministry.